All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Carolina. I am a medical doctor, and today we're going to talk about the dangers of Alzheimer's disease. So before I start talking about Alzheimer's disease, I want to talk a little bit about myself and why I'm talking about this today. So I come from a small country in the middle of Central America called Costa Rica. Probably some of you have heard about it because it's a beautiful place full of nature and beautiful beaches. Probably some of you have never heard about it, and probably some people confuse it with Puerto Rico, which usually happens. But Costa Rica, other than being an incredibly peaceful place, because it's one of the only countries in the world without an army, and it's beautiful nature, it's also one of the 5 blue zones in the world. So what is a blue zone? A blue zone is a place where people tend to live a longer and healthier life than the average population. And there are 5 blue zones in the world. The first one described was Sardinia in Italy. And in 2004, a journalist discovered 4 other places, which are Ikaria in Greece, Okinawa in Japan, Loma Linda in California, and Nicoya in Costa Rica. For the past 2 years, I've been working at a longevity clinic in actually Nicoya, one of the blue zones in the world. And it is a beautiful coastal town. And I worked at this yoga retreat center called Blue Spirit. It's called Blue Spirit because what we want is to teach people how people from the blue zones live, and how to live not only a longer life, but a healthier life for a longer period of time. Here at the Longevity Clinic, we try to challenge the modern medical model, which modern medicine, as most of you know, because most of us have gone to clinics or hospitals, what they do is that they analyze symptoms and diseases and they treat them with pills. What we try to do is to learn about the person, learn about how they move, how they speak, what they think, what they do in their everyday life, because at the end, this is what determines health. Seeing a person as a whole and not only the symptoms their body manifests. And here, we started getting interested in Alzheimer's disease because when we talk about longevity, a lot of people told us the thing that worries me the most about aging is losing my mind. They didn't care about their body hurting or breaking a hip. They cared about not being able to remember their loved ones. And that's when they said that life was not worth living anymore. So we started doing some research in Alzheimer's disease, and what we found out is that it is the 6th most common cause of death in the world. And most shockingly, 1/3 of the cases of Alzheimer's disease are actually preventable. 1/3. Also, we started seeing that changes in the brain from people that developed Alzheimer's disease, changes started happening 20 to 30 years before people started experiencing symptoms. So it's something that can be prevented, and especially in this period where there's changes happening in the brain where we can do something about it and we can prevent it from becoming dementia. So I think most of us know the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease because we might have a relative who has experienced it at some point. And it's mainly memory loss and loss of thinking skills. And there are actually 3 stages of Alzheimer's disease. Stage 1 is called a preclinical phase, meaning the phase where changes in the brain start happening, but there are no symptoms. Stage 2 is we start seeing certain symptoms in the person, such as memory loss. They start forgetting certain things that happened the day before. They start forgetting what they did last week, but they're still able to take care of themselves. And this is called mild cognitive impairment. Stage 3 is dementia, which is when the same symptoms as stage 2, but much more severe, meaning the person can no longer take care of themselves. Stage 1 and stage 2 are the stages where we can actually make lifestyle changes to help slow down the progression to Alzheimer's disease. All right. So when we talk about risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, we have modifiable risk factors, which means things we can change, things we can do to reduce our risk, and non-modifiable risk factors, which means there's nothing we can do about it. The presentation is going to focus, of course, on the modifiable risk factors, but I'm going to explain a little bit the non-modifiable so we can understand the risk in order to make decisions. So, the first one is family history. The risk increases if we have one or more relatives that have had Alzheimer's disease in the past. Race is another non-modifiable risk factor. Latin people, well, us Latin Americans have 1.5 more risk than the general population. Also, age. After the age of 65, the risk doubles every year that goes by. And the last one is genetics. When we talk about genetics, it's very important to separate two types of Alzheimer's disease. There's early onset, which is the Alzheimer's disease you hear about in very young people, which that depends on a gene called presenilin. And there's late onset, which is the topic of this talk, which the genetics depend on a gene called ApoE. Every single one of us has 2 copies of the ApoE gene. So ApoE, you can have ApoE 2, 3, or 4. ApoE 2 is protective against Alzheimer's disease. ApoE 3 it's neutral. It doesn't increase or reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. And ApoE 4 actually increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So you can have any of these combinations because you inherit one from your mother and one from your father. This is a very simple test that you can do. It's a blood test, a genetic test that everyone can do with a neurologist or a longevity doctor. About 25% of the population has an ApoE4 gene. And out of this 25%, they make out 2/3 of the cases of Alzheimer's disease. About 2% of the population has 2 copies. It's very rare. But just having 1 copy can greatly increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease. It is interesting, now that we're studying more medicine and genetics, people that have the ApoE4 gene actually have smaller brains when they are born. That doesn't mean that they're less intelligent than other people. One of the brightest persons I know has 2 ApoE4 genes, and it doesn't impact how well they think, but it definitely increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Having an ApoE4 gene doesn't mean you'll definitely get Alzheimer's disease, but it increases your risk. So you have to actively try to prevent and actually engage in behaviors that prevent the disease from happening. Also, it has been seen that people that have the ApoE4 gene don't absorb omega-3 fatty acids, which comes from fatty fish, very well. And this has a role, which I'll explain in just a minute, with how Alzheimer's disease develops. When people come to my consult and I explain all of this, they ask me, should I get the test? Should I know which is my ApoE4 gene status? And that's very personal. For some people, for example, my grandmother has Alzheimer's disease and my mother refuses to know because she tells me that it will increase her anxiety about Alzheimer's disease. So she just acts like if she has it. Some people like to know because they like to know what is the risk and how much should they be working to avoid Alzheimer's disease. So it's very personal, but I give you the information so you can know and decide if you want to do it. All right, now we're going to get into the modifiable risk factors, and before I get into that, I want to show you these graphs. The right graph is people that have the ApoE4 gene, 1 or 2 copies, and this graph is people that don't have the ApoE4 gene copy. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis is cognitive score, how well they do in cognitive tests. And first, what you can see is that people that have the ApoE4 gene definitely decline at a faster rate. You can see also 2 lines. You can see a dotted line, and you can see a straight line. The dotted line is people that engaged in 4 to 5 healthy behaviors. And we'll talk which are these healthy behaviors. And the bold straight line is people that only engaged in 0 to 1 healthy behaviors. So you can see how, by just living a healthy life, you can help decrease the risk of cognitive decline, whether you have the ApoE4 gene or not. So now let's talk about some of these behaviors. So if you came into my consult, the first question that I would ask all of you is, have you had any head injuries? And why? Because head injuries increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 80%. And this is not limited to concussions. It can be people that were engaged in certain sports, like rugby, that hit their head constantly. This risk is even greater in people that have the ApoE4 gene. But luckily, we can do something about it. But I give this information just in case it resonates with you. If you were in an accident, if you had a head injury and you have family with Alzheimer's disease, it's something that you should be aware about. There's a therapy called hyperbaric oxygen therapy, where you lie down in a chamber and receive pressurized oxygen for about 2 hours. There's promising research relating to head injuries in hyperbaric oxygen chambers that show that 40 to 80 sessions of this type of treatment can actually reduce the risk and the damage done, and will reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. The next question I ask people is, do you know your blood pressure? Do you really know and manage the numbers? Because when you take your blood pressure, there's a big number, which is the systolic blood pressure, and there's a small number, which is the diastolic. So next time that you take your blood pressure, I want you to pay attention. I want you to write it down and see if the big number, if the systolic is under 130. If it's not, ask your doctor, what can I do to lower it down? But usually living a healthy lifestyle will do it, but we want to always keep it below 130. The third question I ask people is, do you smoke? Because smoking can increase the risk of having Alzheimer's disease by 60%. Luckily, the risk goes back to normal after 9 years of not smoking. So if you were wondering if you should quit or not, this is your signal to quit smoking, because it can greatly increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease as well. The other question I ask people is, do you know your blood glucose level? Do you know if you're at risk of diabetes? Because it has been seen that diabetes increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 58%. And about 50 to 80% of people that have Alzheimer's are actually diabetic. New research from the University of Montreal has showed that diabetes actually, or Alzheimer's, could actually be a manifestation of diabetes. And sometimes it's even called type 3 diabetes. And this happens because when there's an increase of glucose in your blood, or there's diabetes, diabetes is a disease where things go out of the blood into the organs. So things that we don't want in our organs start leaking out uncontrollably. So in the brain, we have something called the blood-brain barrier. As its name says, it is a barrier between our blood and the brain. The brain is one of our most precious organs, so we don't want toxins getting into the brain. So this barrier really prevents anything that can cause inflammation, that can cause damage to get into the brain. Also, it helps things that need to go out to get out efficiently. With diabetes, we have, since everything is leaking out, this also happens in the brain. So toxins that we don't want leaking into our brain start leaking out and causing something called neuroinflammation. So one of the main steps, or one of the main goals, is having a normal glucose if you really want to avoid diabetes. And how do we do this? Well, mainly through two methods. Muscle is the first one. Building up muscle through lifting weights. As we start aging, we start losing muscle and gaining fat. This is a process called sarcopenia. So in order to fight it, most of us, or most people over the age of 65, have to start lifting weights. And they have to start eating enough protein. About 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilogram of protein per day. Because if not, you'll start losing muscle. And muscle is the main site of activity of glucose. It's where we use glucose the most. So if you want to prevent diabetes, you need to have enough muscle. The second one is engaging in some sort of caloric restriction. So what is caloric restriction? It means eating slightly less calories than what you should. Most people need about 1,700 to 2,000 calories per day. It's very easy to know how many calories we need if we know our weight, our height, and our level of activity. So there are many ways to restrict calories. And when I say restrict calories, I don't mean it in a way in which you punish yourself because you're eating too much, but rather in a loving way in which you know how much you have to eat to keep your system in balance. And there are many ways to actually achieve this. There's intermittent fasting, that probably some of you have heard about it, which is 16 hours of not eating and 8 hours of eating. There's the keto diet, which works. It is not eating any kind of carbohydrate, and it works as a type of caloric restriction because fat satiates us much more than carbohydrates. So we end up eating less calories in this type of diet. And there's also counting calories, that for some people, this and intermittent fasting, especially if they have had eating disorders, it can trigger binge eating, and I wouldn't recommend it. So you can follow any of these kinds of diets and engage in strength training, and these are two activities that can help you or prevent diabetes. Also, regarding nutrition, limiting alcohol intake. Drinking more than 1 glass of wine per day for women and about 1.5 glasses of wine per day can increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease greatly. Also, nutrition-wise, caffeine has actually been found to be protective. But why? Because most people don't eat vegetables, and sometimes caffeine is their main source of antioxidants. So eating enough vegetables and caffeine have been found to be protective against Alzheimer's disease as well. Also, regarding exercise, we talked a little bit about strength training, but there's another kind of exercise called high-intensity interval training. And high-intensity interval training is a kind of exercise where you do maximum effort. Imagine like sprinting for a short period of time, and then you rest. Whenever we exercise, we go through 6 different zones of exercise. Zone 1 is like walking, and zone 6 is the maximum intensity of exercise that you can imagine. When you do light exercise, you do a type of exercise that's called aerobic, meaning we use oxygen to create energy and be able to move. Aerobic exercise is zone 1 and zone 2. Whenever we increase the intensity at high intensity exercise, we go through a different type of metabolism called anaerobic metabolism, where we don't use oxygen. This creates a product called lactic acid. And high intensity interval training, what it does is that when you do maximum effort, you go to zone 5 or zone 6, and then you rest. And then you go again to zone 5 and zone 6, and then you rest. So you're creating a lot of lactate. And what scientists have found is that this lactate can actually repair the damage that has been done to the blood-brain barrier. It can repair the cells that have been lost and actually reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So engaging in this type of training 2 to 3 times per week, what we usually recommend is 4 minutes of very intense exercise followed by 4 minutes of rest, and you repeat it 4 to 6 times. 2 to 3 times per week can actually decrease your risk of Alzheimer's disease, whether you're at stage 1 or stage 2, and repair the damage done to your blood-brain barrier. So avoiding diabetes and high-intensity interval training can help repair that blood-brain barrier. The other factor I ask people is, how's your stress? And when I talk about stress, I don't only talk about major traumatic events, but how we deal with stress on our day-to-day lives. Which are our resources when we have difficult situations? So seeing the world in a positive light, mindfulness, therapy, are all incredible tools that we should integrate in our plan to help reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Another interesting intervention that has been effective in increasing the flow of blood to the brain and reducing the risk of Alzheimer's is Kundalini yoga. So there's this, it's called Kirtan Kriya, in which people do kind of a chant in which they move their fingers. I'll try to do it without the microphone, but it usually takes 12 minutes, and you have to chant. You try to chant those syllables, 2 minutes in a normal voice, 2 minutes in a whisper, 4 minutes to yourself, and then 2 minutes in a whisper and 2 minutes in a normal voice. And if you practice that for 12 minutes every day, it has actually shown to increase the flow of blood to your brain and help with the symptoms of mild cognitive impairment and reduce the progression to dementia. Now, a little bit about the vitamins and supplements that have shown to work to reduce the risk. So whenever there's damage in our brain, there's usually a marker in our blood that elevates called homocysteine. And homocysteine usually signals B vitamin deficiency. So in people that have Alzheimer's disease, there's some benefit from taking vitamin B6, B12, and folic acid. Also, there has been a link with low vitamin D and Alzheimer's disease. So I recommend checking your levels of vitamin D and making sure that you're supplementing enough, especially during the winter months. Also, curcumin or turmeric has shown to reduce the damage done in the brain through PET scans. Cocoa, cacao, flavonols has shown to increase the flow of blood in the brain as well. And fish oil, as I told you during the beginning of the presentation, people that have the ApoE4 gene actually absorb omega-3 fatty acids worse than other people. So if you have family with Alzheimer's disease, if you did a test and you have the ApoE4 gene, then supplementing with fish oil 2 to 3 grams per day becomes increasingly important. Another important part of Alzheimer's disease that some people ignore is oral health. Gum inflammation has shown to, when we have periodontal disease or we have gum disease, we create inflammation throughout our body. So there's a link with gum disease and actually heart disease and brain disease. So actually brushing your teeth twice a day, because there was a survey done, and in the world it was shown that about 70% of people wash their teeth twice a day. And they don't usually do it for a full 2 minutes, that's what's recommended, and they don't do it with an electric toothbrush, which is what's recommended as well. So, washing your teeth, going to the dentist, making sure that you don't have gum disease becomes important not only to avoid Alzheimer's disease, but also to avoid heart disease. Also, I want to add that heavy metals have been linked to Alzheimer's disease as well, especially mercury. Mercury usually is in our oceans, and it's around people that have lived close to the coal mining industry. So checking your levels of mercury, if you have family with Alzheimer's disease, is important to reduce your risk. And there are many ways to get mercury out of your body. This is a process called chelation, which you can do with a medication, or you can also do it through supplements. But checking your mercury levels is incredibly important. Also, regarding mercury, if you have high mercury, avoiding fish that contain mercury, such as tuna, swordfish, shark, king mackerel, will help reduce the risk. Also, in some cases, people used to have mercury fillings or mercury amalgams in their mouth. So if you had mercury fillings, make sure to go to the dentist to check that you don't have them anymore, to remove them. Or if you have lived close to any place that had a coal mining industry, make sure that you check mercury levels with your doctor to get that out of your system and reduce the risk. So as a summary of this, education and knowledge is power. So knowing your numbers, knowing the answer to all of these questions is important to reduce your risk. Because sometimes we believe that health is only the health system. Health is only found in hospitals and clinics. And truly, health is found everywhere, and it's mostly in our everyday life. So the agency or the capacity to act has been known as the main determinant of health. What we do with our health, how we manage our health, how much we know about your health is much more important than going to a hospital or clinic when we feel bad. And what we do every day is the most important action we can take for our health. So thank you very much for your attention. It is an honor to be here, and I open up the space for any questions that you might have. Any questions for anyone? Yes?
Hi, how are you? My name is Radek, and I have a question. I also noticed recently with the development of AI technologies that some companies in the health sector introduced some methods how AI can spot early Alzheimer's disease on by observing the eyes. And do you have any experience with that, or is that promising?
Not precisely with the type of AI, but there's a lot of technology exactly regarding this, with the first stages of Alzheimer's disease. Those changes we see in the brain 20 to 30 years before the symptoms start. So we've started to develop, we mostly do it through magnetic resonance, which is an imaging test where we can start seeing the changes in the brain But there's also technologies being developed. I was actually talking to a neurologist yesterday who told me that the major, well, of course, the pharmaceutical industry is trying to start medications that actually act during this phase. So there's a lot of diagnostic tools that are being developed to catch it early, to catch it when imaging starts, and there's where we can see the greatest, the interventions really working to stop the disease from developing. I forgot to also say that I didn't include sleep here because we have the world sleep expert coming to the conference, but also not sleeping increases your risk. And what we need to sleep usually is 7 to 8 hours, and sleep is so important because when we sleep, the brain swells up to help us get rid of toxins through our spinal fluid. So when we sleep, it's like taking out the trash of the brain, and if we don't sleep, we don't take out that trash, and it ends up causing that neuroinflammation we talked about that can end up leading to Alzheimer's disease. So if you feel you don't sleep well, I recommend going to Matthew Walker's talk tomorrow. So that can also be a great complement if you're interested in all of these topics. Any other questions?
Hi there, my name is Daniel. Thank you, Doc, for the presentation, for what you're doing. It seems to me that most of the approaches that you listed and elaborated on were rather somatic. I'm interested in what's your take on the psycho, meaning what effect can on the progression of our minds towards Alzheimer and the dementia can have, for example, positive thinking, or basically what we have in our mind, which is not so tangible. Thank you.
Yes, well, that's the part of stress, and stress can be a very big topic because for every single one of us it's different. But stress, meaning how really we deal with situations in our life, which resources we have whenever a difficult situation presents in our life, which is not necessarily a big trauma. It can be when we have a lot of work, when we have problems with our partner, when we got in a fight. Even those small things can help increase cortisol in our body, feel stress, which can increase our risk of Alzheimer's disease. So knowing how to handle it, and this could be through daily meditation, this can be through therapy, this could be through journaling, this could be through, even we can introduce the role of psychedelics in medicine and how they can help with this kind of probably negative thinking. And of course, having good support, having friends and family around us that love us and support us is also important when we think about the development of Alzheimer's disease, because definitely stress is a big part. And when I talked about agency or our capacity to act, I think it really depends on our relationship the relationship we have with ourselves. Because if we don't love ourselves enough, it's when we believe we don't have time to do what it takes to take care of ourselves. So also developing a healthy relationship with oneself psychologically is integral with, or it's one of the most important steps towards preventing any kind of disease. Any other question? All right. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Michael. I would like to ask you, you mentioned that the changes in the brain happen 20 or 30 years prior the clinical symptoms.
Yes.
Are those changes reversible, or using the methods you mentioned to prevent Alzheimer's disease, can it modify the changes to reverse back or not?
It can't reverse back, but what we have seen is that it can stop the progression from. When you have the changes, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily develop Alzheimer's disease. That is the first step. Those are like the first signals that you might develop Alzheimer's disease in the future. So the changes are actually more important in this phase because they can slow down the progression or they can stop it at this point. You won't get your brain back. The changes are not reversible, but definitely it can slow down or even completely prevent from you developing the symptoms. So this is when it's most important to actually act and look at all the numbers that I mentioned and start implementing all the actions that I mentioned.
Good afternoon, my name is Mark. I would like to ask you, during your presentation, you were speaking about ApoE. It's exactly the copies of genes for apolipoproteins, E, or something else?
No, well, ApoE is, when we talk about LPA little proteins, and when we talk about, I think what you're thinking is ApoB, which is related to cholesterol. And these are like very bad cholesterol that can get stuck in our arteries. When I talk about ApoE, I'm talking about a gene we inherit from our father and our mother, and that we have and we cannot change. It is not a marker of disease, but it's something that we already have. It's useful for some people because it helps them motivate them and to really know their risk of Alzheimer's disease, how much risk they have, but it's not something you can change or measure. It's just a gene that you have.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Hi, it's me again. Can I have another question, please?
Of course.
Speaking about the genes, we also heard about gene modification in China, like the CRISPR technology. Mm-hmm. Is this something you think can be also usable for treating these genes and preventing exactly sorry.
Yeah, no, I understand. I know it's difficult with English. Well, I actually don't really know if it's possible. I think I think everything is possible, but with that, I don't think specifically for Alzheimer's disease, with the current knowledge we have, because it might change in 5 to 10 years, but with the current knowledge we have, I don't really think so. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm very honored, and thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.